In Japan, Shinzo Abe is stepping aside, citing ill health. The big question for Japan is, who's going to replace him, and will they continue on the same economic agenda he started to try and tackle the country's struggling economic growth and deflation? Many argue his policies haven't worked, but the question is, would the alternative have been even worse for the country? It's surely not a time for more fiscal control and, dare I say it, austerity. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So, Steve, we've all got to, I guess, to get used to the idea that we've had this massive drop in GDP from the coronavirus. And the big question we've all got now is what's going to happen next? Do we all become like Japan, where, of course, you know, they're used to low GDP. GDP growth has been trickling around 1% or less for the last decade. And in fact, the decade before that, they're calling it the lost decades for Japan. But if you take those 2 decades and then go back to the 1980s, you've got this long period of virtually zero inflation. In fact, periods of deflation. And the answer to that from Shinzo Abe, of course, particularly to tackle that deflation, was a three-pronged approach: monetary easing. In other words, very low interest rates from the Bank of Japan, along with introducing quantitative easing before it became fashionable, fiscal stimulus from the government, and structural reforms. Those 3 prongs are what became known as Abenomics. Now, that pretty much sounds like what every country is now doing, isn't it? Because, the similar 3-pronged approach, which is interesting because it hasn't really worked for Japan, has it? So what makes people think it's going to work now?
Well, it's worked for Japan in the sense that what they had beforehand was immense level of stagnation, and after a period of about 20, it's not actually a lost decade, it's almost like a lost quarter century. But in the final period of that lost quarter century, it has started to get some growth. But it's nonetheless, the economy hasn't died. And if you look at what's gone on, it's been non-stop deficit spending. And one thing, I saw a lovely little meme on the on internet a couple of days ago of a son talking to his dad, the son wearing a cowboy outfit. It's obviously he's been done something playing cowboy in the backyard, and the dad is saying, "That's mad, and that's mad, and that's mad," you know. And they said what the kid's doing is talking about, well, if you have runaway government spending, you're going to have runaway inflation. And the dad says, Japan. I said, but if you do it for that long, you're going to lose control of your currency. Japan. And I think Japan confounds everything about the mainstream expectations.
So is it a good argument in favour of monetary theory then? Apart from the fact, obviously, they haven't totally embraced it, though, have they? Because they've still got this expectation that they're paying it back. In fact, 22% of the government spending goes back on paying interest payments. If they just didn't do that...
That's inevitable, and this is the funny thing, because we talked a bit about the mechanics of this, and we'll do more obviously as the coming months on the mechanics of how the government actually finances itself. But if you think about I'll go back and give you the data here, and this is the quite fascinating thing. Of course, this data ignores the data that I focus upon, which is absolutely critical, but I'll ignore it for the meantime. And if you go back to 1980, let me check out the data here, 87, the Japanese government debt peaked at 64% of GDP. Absolutely terrifying. And then they had this wonderful period of about a decade, so going from not quite a decade, pardon me, about 5 years, 87 to 91, so halfway through 87 to halfway through 91, so 4 years, where they managed to reduce government debt. Fantastic, great performance, guys, from 64% of GDP to 54%, so a 10% fall. Since then, it has gone from 54% of GDP to its current level of 218% of GDP. Now, if you're a mainstream thinker, you're going to say, oh, runaway inflation, Japan, because you take a look at the numbers and the CPI, just look at the inflation rate over that period. We're going back to the highest rate of inflation Japan has had in the last 40 years. And trust my program to decide not to work on me all of a sudden. Hang on a second.
Well, while it's coming back, while you're yelling obscenities at your machine, I mean, the other way of looking at it as well is you look at what the Bank of Japan is holding in assets, and that's gone from 2010, 120 trillion yen in assets, up to now 578, just before the coronavirus. So it'll be worse now, 578 trillion. So I mean, that's the vast majority of that is government bonds. In fact, increasingly the proportion of it is government bonds. So that's just buying up that debt. So and that's where those interest payments, having to pay those interest payments, are coming from. But the mechanics of it, if there was another way, they wouldn't have to do that.
Well, the point we made a couple of days ago, I was actually finishing the inflation point because I wanted to get that in there. In 1980, just the beginning of 1980, so before this period, so this is going back 40 years, the inflation rate was 8.7%. By 1990, when its crisis began, it was down to 3.9. Since 2000, it has normally been hovering around zero. There have been periods like 2002, and it's been minus 1.5%. It's been as deep as minus 2.5% during the financial crisis in 2009, and it's currently running at 0.3% per annum. So,
but that's a problem, isn't it? I mean, not having inflation, having deflation, which, by the way, is what we're now seeing in Europe. The question is that temporary because of the coronavirus, or is it the start of having deflation here? That's, I mean, you know, for reasons we've spoken about in the past, deflation is not good. I mean, first of all, who's going to buy stuff if you think it's going to be cheaper in the future?
Yeah, and this is the danger. They've fallen into a classic debt deflationary trap, but they've managed to prevent how deeply they've gone into that trap by massive levels of government spending. And so that's the thing which is different about Abenomics compared to what the mainstream politicians and economists are doing elsewhere in the world, is they haven't felt restrained by running a government deficit. They've kept on doing it. And because they run a government deficit, their debt levels have gone, in terms of government debt, from as I said, a bottom 55% to 220%. So basically a fourfold increase in the level of private debt to GDP. And just recently I had a bit of an exchange with someone over the infamous Rogon and Rogoff paper, Reinhardt and Rogoff paper, about how once you get past 90% of GDP, it's all disaster. Well, this is almost three times that. And Japan, whatever else it isn't a disaster compared to the macroeconomic performance of the rest of the world.
So what did they say how did they say that disaster would play out? Did they say, yes, that would create runaway inflation?
They said the disaster played out by, first of all, was producing a spreadsheet with straight-out spreadsheet errors, then by aggregating things. So 1 year in New Zealand was equivalent to 40 years of data in the UK, and a whole range of it was almost as good. As good as William Nordhaus.
But what did they say?
Much lower than that.
But what was their conclusion, though? That if you had if debt got over
false.
Right, okay. But their false conclusion, let me get to this. So they were saying if you got over 90...
over 90%, your economy will slow down.
Right.
Okay. Rate of economic growth.
But it's also not picking up, is it? I guess that's the other side of the equation. And look, if you want to hear more of this discussion about Abenomics or Arbenomics, call it how you want, then you'll need to become a subscriber on debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. On Patreon as well, you'll also be able to watch a video of all of this. You might not want to do that. A couple of old men talking economics. But if you do want to do that, then become a supporter of Steve's and you'll get access to that as well. If not, we'll catch you here again next time for another shortened version of the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie. See you then.